Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's just dive straight into this meticulously unsealed prophetic blueprint. This whole framework is derived entirely from the author's analytical timeline of ancient biblical texts. We're going to walk through a highly specific chronological case study today, one that claims to piece together the exact dates of the end times, literally mapping out everything from global conflict to the precise day of the rapture. Remember, our goal here is simply to neutrally unpack the source material and explore how the author uses this step-by-step methodology to reach some frankly startling conclusions. So let's get started. For our student audience today, think of this agenda as our syllabus. 1. The unsealed prophetic timeline. 2. The 1,260-day witness mission. 3. Tribulation versus God's wrath. 4. The September 2030 rapture. And 5. 10 days of protection. We are going to trace step by step how the source calculates these exact dates, leading right up to the year 2030.
Section 1. The Unsealed Prophetic Timeline. To start off, the author maps out these major chronological anchors, establishing a very precise mathematical formula for the end times. According to the source, a prophetic clock that was essentially paused back in the 1st century is about to resume. This timeline kicks off a final 1,260-day countdown on April 27, 2027. It culminates in a rapture event on September 27 to 28, 2030, and then wraps up exactly 10 days later on October 7, 2030. It's an exact mathematically derived framework that literally anchors every single one of the author's remaining claims.
Now, you might be wondering, what about that famous verse in Matthew 24 that says, "No one knows the day or hour"? Well, the source tackles that objection right out of the gate. The author uses Revelation 1:1 to argue that, sure, while the Son didn't know the day or hour originally on the Mount of Olives, the Father actually unsealed this knowledge later on and gave it to him decades later on the island of Patmos. The argument here is that the seal was on the book, not on the watchman, and according to this text, that seal has absolutely now been broken.
So, treating this scripture almost like an algebra equation, the author outlines the mathematical steps that bridge the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. The timeline posits that Jesus' earthly ministry fulfilled exactly half of a prophesied 7-year period, often called Daniel's 70th week. That leaves precisely 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, left to fulfill. This final countdown is triggered after a designated 30-day apostasy window starting in late March 2027, and that locks in April 27, 2027 as day 1 of the Great Tribulation. The author even points to standard online day calculators to plot out exactly 1,260 days from April 27, 2027, which lands squarely in late September 2030. And if you add the extra 30 days for that apostasy period, it gives us the 1,290 days mentioned in the book of Daniel, stretching the timeline perfectly to October 7, 2030. Every single day is mathematically accounted for in this strictly enforced framework.
Section 2. The 1,260-day witness mission.
So what exactly is going on during those 1,260 days? Well, the source argues that believers are definitely not going to be passive victims, just sitting around waiting to be rescued. Instead, they'll be empowered to witnesses, performing very specific miraculous works during a time of massive global turmoil. The text asserts that ordinary Christians will receive the exact same power we see in the book of Acts, healing the sick, casting out demons, and preaching globally. And to avoid being charged with murder while defending themselves, the author claims they won't use physical weapons at all. Instead, they will literally command fire from their mouths just by speaking the word "burn" against their attackers. It is an intensely militant, highly supernatural mission.
The author predicts this witness mission occurs right in the middle of devastating nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare, what the source refers to as the intense Ezekiel 38 wars. The text paints this incredibly vivid picture of a world in utter chaos, where empowered believers are operating in the most dangerous places on earth. They're supposedly putting hospitals out of business with miraculous healings, all while literal missiles are flying and economies are completely collapsing around them.
Section 3. Tribulation versus God's wrath.
Right here is where the source introduces an absolutely crucial theological nuance regarding the timeline of punishment. The author draws a super strict distinction between two entirely different types of wrath. You know, people often ask, why would a loving God leave believers on earth during the Great Tribulation? Well, the author argues that the tribulation is actually Satan's wrath, meant to wear down the saints. God simply permits it as a final period of testing and witnessing. But that is entirely separate from God's wrath, which the text says only occurs in the final 10 days of the timeline, and from which believers are promised total, absolute protection.
Section 4. The September 2030 Rapture.
And this step-by-step reasoning naturally brings us to the ultimate climax of the unsealed timeline. The author identifies a specific Hebrew feast day, Yom Teruah, or the Day of Trumpets, as the precise moment those 1,250 days of witnessing are cut short. Falling on September 27th and 28th, 2030, the text emphasizes that this date isn't just random. It supposedly aligns perfectly with the Hebrew calendar as the first day of the 6,001st year since Adam, marking the definitive end of humanity's 6,000-year lease on Earth.
The source points definitively to this exact date, emphatically stating, "This is the day of the resurrection, rapture, and return of Jesus." According to the blueprint, this is what brings a sudden end to the believer's dangerous earthly ministry. The two witnesses who have been operating globally and potentially dying piecemeal across the world will be resurrected, and their enemies, who the text says will literally be celebrating their deaths, will just watch in absolute terror as they rise into the clouds.
Section 5. 10 Days of Protection. But what happens immediately following this massive event? Well, according to the author's literal reading of Isaiah 26:20, raptured believers will be told to enter into your rooms and close your doors behind you. For exactly 10 days, known in Jewish tradition as the Days of Awe, they will be tucked safely away in their celestial apartments in the New Jerusalem. And while they're safely hidden away, those final, devastating bowls of God's wrath are poured out on the earth below.
But source draws a direct parallel here. Just like God pulled Noah, Lot, and Rahab out of danger just in the nick of time, this 10-day period is when the faithful are sheltered from the ultimate divine judgment. Think of it kind of like being in a highly fortified underground bunker, but on a heavenly scale. It represents a complete, total separation from the final carnage happening down on earth.
And the mathematical timeline concludes precisely here on October 7th, 2030, which is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The author makes a pretty striking modern connection here, pointing out that October 7th, 2030 is exactly 7 years to the day after the 2023 Hamas attack. In this chronological framework, this date marks the exact moment believers emerged from their 10-day protection to await the start of the 1,000-year millennial kingdom, perfectly fulfilling the fall feast days in sequential order.
As we wrap up this explainer, the author leaves us with a really stark choice. If this mathematical timeline is entirely unsealed, it means the clock starts ticking in 2027. So what does this all mean for you? Will you dismiss this chronological blueprint as mere speculation? Or, if the countdown truly has begun, are you prepared to be an active witness on day one?